The morning sun slipped through the curtains, bathing the small room in gold. The maid sat on the edge of her bed, holding a letter in her hands, a letter that could change everything. It had arrived the day before, sealed in an envelope with the logo of the National Music Conservatory. Her heart raced each time she looked at it. The lady of the house had been the one to bring it to her, saying softly, "It's for you. I think it's about your music." The maid hadn't opened it right away. She was afraid of what it might say. Hope was a powerful thing, but it could hurt too, especially for someone who had learned to live without expecting much. That morning, she finally took a deep breath and opened it. Her hands trembled as she read the first few lines. Then she covered her mouth in disbelief. She had been accepted. The letter invited her to join a special program for talented adults who had never received formal recognition. The program was short but intense, a chance to study, perform, and even play alongside professional musicians. It felt like a dream too big for someone like her. Yet here it was, written in ink, waiting for her to believe it. She read the letter again and again, her heart swelling with a mix of joy and fear. For a long time, she just sat there trying to take it all in. Then she looked up at the ceiling and whispered, "Thank you." She didn't even know who she was thanking. Maybe life itself, maybe fate. When she told the lady of the house, the woman smiled with real warmth. "I knew this would happen," she said gently. "You worked hard for it. You deserve every bit of it." The maid couldn't stop the tears from forming. "I don't know what to say. You've done so much for me." The lady shook her head. "You did this yourself. I only gave you the chance." Her teacher, too, was overjoyed when he heard the news. "I told you," he said with a proud grin. "You're proof that talent never dies. It just waits for courage to wake it." But even with all the happiness, she felt nervous. She wasn't sure if she belonged in such a place. The conservatory was filled with students from well-off families, trained since childhood, confident and polished. What would they think of her? A maid from a rich household walking in among them with calloused hands and worn shoes. The teacher saw the worry in her eyes and said quietly, "Don't compare yourself. You don't need to be like them. You only need to be yourself. That's what makes your music different." She nodded, but deep down she was still scared. The day of her first class arrived sooner than she expected. She woke early, dressed neatly, and walked to the conservatory with the letter clutched in her hand. The building was beautiful. Large windows, marble floors, and the faint echo of music drifting through the halls. Inside, she saw students carrying sheet music, talking excitedly, their laughter filling the air. For a moment, she felt out of place, but then she remembered why she was there. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The classes were harder than she imagined. The lessons moved fast, and the others seemed to know things she didn't. But she listened carefully, practiced more than anyone else, and never complained. The teacher who led the program noticed her dedication and began giving her extra guidance. "You play with something they can't learn from books," he told her one day. "Emotion. That's your strength. Don't lose it." Weeks turned into months. She improved quickly, not because she wanted fame, but because she truly loved what she was doing. Her music grew deeper, richer, like a story that kept unfolding. Then one afternoon, the head of the conservatory made an announcement. "We'll be hosting a charity concert next month," he said. "It will feature our students and a few special guests. I'd like you," he said, looking at her, "to perform as part of it." She froze. "Me?" she asked softly. He smiled. "Yes, you. Your story, your journey. It's inspiring. People should hear your music." Her heart raced. It was the biggest stage she had ever been offered. She nodded slowly, unable to hide her emotion. "Thank you," she whispered. The weeks leading up to the concert were filled with preparation. She practiced every evening after work, sometimes until her fingers ached. The lady of the house encouraged her constantly, making sure she had everything she needed. Even the other maids in the mansion started helping her finish her chores earlier, saying things like, "Go practice. You'll make us proud." It felt like everyone was silently cheering for her. The night of the concert arrived. The hall was grand and glittering, filled with people dressed in elegant clothes. She stood behind the curtain, trying to calm her nerves. Her teacher stood beside her, his eyes full of pride. "Remember," he said quietly, "don't play for them. Play for yourself. Play for the girl who once thought she'd never touch a piano again." She nodded, taking a deep breath. When her name was announced, she stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, and for a moment she couldn't see the audience. She sat down at the piano, the same way she had done countless times before, but this time it felt different. This time she wasn't hiding. She began to play. The first notes floated through the hall like a whisper of memory. The melody was soft, emotional, a song she had written herself about her journey from the shadows into the light. Every chord spoke of struggle, loss, and hope. The audience listened in complete silence, drawn into her story. As the music grew stronger, so did her heart. She remembered the night she had played alone in the mansion, the first time she dared to touch the keys again, the people who once mocked her, and those who later believed in her. By the time she reached the final note, her hands were trembling. She let the sound linger, then slowly lifted her fingers from the keys. The hall was silent for a moment, then erupted in applause. People stood clapping, cheering. Some had tears in their eyes. It was a moment she would never forget. Her teacher hugged her afterward, whispering, "You've done it. You've shown the world who you are." The head of the conservatory congratulated her warmly. "Your performance will be remembered," he said. "Would you consider joining us as a permanent student next season?" She was speechless. The dream she once buried deep inside her heart was finally alive again, stronger than ever. After the concert, people came up to her, asking about her life, her story. Some couldn't believe that a maid could play like that, but she only smiled and said, "Music doesn't care who you are. It only listens to your heart." That night, she walked home under the stars, holding her small bag and the letter of invitation from the conservatory. When she reached the mansion, the lady of the house was waiting by the door. She opened her arms and said softly, "You made us all proud." The maid smiled, her eyes shining. "I couldn't have done it without you." The lady shook her head. "You could have. I just gave you space to shine." The days that followed were full of new beginnings. She continued working at the mansion, but not as a simple maid anymore. The lady made sure she had a special schedule that allowed her to study full-time while still helping when needed. Sometimes, when guests visited, they would ask her to play a piece. And every time she did, the room would grow quiet, the same way it had that first night when she revealed her hidden gift. Months later, she performed again, this time on a real concert stage with hundreds of people listening. The lights, the sound, the applause, everything felt unreal. But deep inside, she stayed the same. She never forgot where she came from or how it all began. And though she was no longer the maid in people's eyes, she still carried that part of herself with pride. Because it was during those quiet, unseen years that she had learned the most important lesson, that greatness can bloom anywhere, even in silence. In time, her story spread far beyond her city. People wrote about her, calling her the hidden pianist, the maid with the golden hands. Some even compared her to legends. But she always smiled and said, "I'm just someone who refused to stop dreaming." Every time she played now, she thought of all the people who had ever been told they weren't good enough, that their dreams were too far away. She played for them, for the quiet dreamers, the unseen souls, the ones who kept their music alive even when no one listened. And when the final notes of her concerts filled the air, she always looked up for a moment, remembering the girl she once was, the one who used to clean the piano before she dared to play it. Because that girl, brave enough to try one more time, had changed everything. The next few weeks felt like a quiet storm inside her. Every morning she worked as usual, cleaning, sweeping, polishing, but her thoughts were always somewhere else. Between folding sheets and scrubbing floors, she kept hearing the same question in her head. Which performance should I choose? The community one, arranged by her old teacher, or the one at the grand party where the rich guests would be waiting? Both scared her, but for different reasons. One felt like a step toward freedom. The other felt like walking straight into the same world that once looked down on her. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe fate wanted her to do both. Maybe this was her time to stop hiding. She practiced every night, alone in the grand hall of the mansion. The soft glow of the chandelier above and the faint ticking of the clock were her only audience. Sometimes she'd close her eyes and imagine a real crowd, faces she couldn't see, hearts she hoped to touch. One night, as she played, the old piano teacher visited again. The lady of the house had invited him after hearing her practice. She didn't know what to expect, but when she saw him, she smiled with surprise. "You've been improving," he said gently after she finished her piece. "Your fingers have found their confidence again." She laughed softly. They still tremble sometimes. That's not fear, he said. That's feeling. Don't lose that. The lady of the house listened quietly as the two spoke. For the first time, she saw the maid not as a worker, but as someone carrying something rare, a gift that deserved to be seen. She finally said, "You'll play at the event. I'll make sure you have time to practice, and we'll arrange a dress for you. Something simple but elegant." The maid froze. No one had ever offered her such kindness before. Her throat tightened as she whispered, "Thank you." The lady nodded. "You've earned it." The following days felt like a dream. The mansion staff whispered about the upcoming event. Some admired her courage while others still doubted. A maid playing for the guests? It's never been done, someone muttered in the hallway, but she ignored the talk. Every moment she got, she practiced. The teacher helped her choose the piece when something powerful yet full of emotion. "It must sound like your story," he told her. "Play your life into it." Each night her music grew stronger. Her fingers told tales of pain, endurance, and hope. She played until her eyes grew heavy and her heart felt light again. The night before the event, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window watching the moonlight spill across the garden. The paper with the music notes lay on her lap, though she no longer needed to look at it. She had memorized every sound, every pause, every emotion. The morning arrived like a whisper. The mansion buzzed with activity. Cooks preparing dishes, staff arranging flowers, and musicians tuning their instruments. The maid's heart raced as she dressed in the gown the lady had given her. It was pale blue with simple lace at the edges. When she saw herself in the mirror, she almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. The teacher arrived early and smiled when he saw her. "You look like you belong on that stage," he said. "I still feel like I'm dreaming," she admitted softly. He touched her shoulder gently. "Then dream with open eyes. Tonight you'll remind everyone what real beauty sounds like." By evening, the mansion was filled with guests. Wealthy faces, expensive jewelry, polite laughter. The grand hall glowed under the golden lights. As she stood behind the curtain waiting for her turn, her hands trembled slightly. She could hear the sound of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation. Then the lady of the house stepped onto the small stage. Her voice was calm as she said, "Tonight we have a special performance. Someone you all know, though perhaps not in this way. She works quietly among us every day, yet she carries a gift none of us expected. Please welcome her." The guests looked puzzled, whispering among themselves. When the maid stepped out, a soft wave of surprise spread through the room. Some recognized her instantly, the maid who cleaned their tables, who served their drinks. For a moment she wanted to turn back. The weight of their eyes felt heavy, but then she remembered the teacher's words, "Play your life into it." She took a deep breath, sat at the piano, and placed her fingers on the keys. The first note was soft, almost like a sigh. Then came the second, clearer, stronger. Slowly, the music began to grow. Every sound carried a memory. The pain of losing her dream, the long years of silence, the quiet nights she spent playing when no one listened. Her fingers moved faster, her heart guiding every note. The room fell silent. The laughter stopped. Even the waiters paused in their steps. The melody wrapped around everyone like a story told without words, a story of someone who refused to give up. Tears welled in the lady's eyes as she listened. She realized that this wasn't just music, it was truth. It was the sound of a woman finding herself again. When the final note faded into the air, the silence lasted for a heartbeat longer before the applause came. It started softly, a few claps, hesitant but sincere, then grew louder and louder until the room was filled with the sound of people standing and clapping. The maid stood slowly, her eyes glistening with tears. She looked out at the sea of faces, some smiling, some emotional, all changed. The teacher was in the crowd, his eyes full of pride. The lady of the house stepped forward, placing a hand on the maid's shoulder. "You've given us something priceless," she whispered. "You've reminded us what real grace looks like." The maid smiled, though her hand still trembled. "Thank you for believing in me," she said quietly. That night, people spoke of nothing else. The guests couldn't stop talking about her, the maid who played like a hidden prodigy. Some called her a miracle. Others said she was the heart of the evening. For her, though, it wasn't about fame or attention. It was about something deeper. She had finally been heard. After the event ended, when everyone left and the mansion grew quiet again, she stayed by the piano. The candles were burning low, the hall empty except for her and the instrument. She ran her fingers over the keys and smiled. The teacher joined her one last time. "You did it," he said softly. "But this isn't the end. It's only the beginning." She nodded slowly. "I want to keep learning. I want to see how far I can go," he smiled. "Then let's make that happen." The following weeks brought more surprises. Her performance spread quickly through word of mouth. A few guests offered to sponsor her if she wished to study music again. The lady of the house, true to her promise, supported her fully. She arranged her work hours so the maid could attend classes during the day and continue helping in the evenings. It wasn't easy. Balancing lessons and chores was tiring, but the maid never complained. Every moment at the piano felt like breathing, natural, necessary, and full of joy. The teacher guided her through complex pieces, helping her rediscover her rhythm and strength. Sometimes she would laugh, remembering how afraid she once was to even touch the piano again. One afternoon, while she was practicing at the music school, a young student approached her and said shyly, "I saw your video. You were amazing." The maid smiled in surprise. "My video?" The student nodded. "Someone filmed your performance at the mansion and posted it online. Everyone's talking about you. They say you play with real soul." Her heart raced. She didn't know what to say. She had never thought her music would reach people beyond that room. That night, when she returned home, she found the lady waiting for her with a gentle smile. "It's true," the lady said. "You've become quite the inspiration." The maid sat down quietly, overwhelmed. "I don't understand how this happened," she said softly. The lady replied, "Because people don't forget truth. They feel it. You reminded them that greatness doesn't always come from where we expect it." Tears filled her eyes again, not from sadness this time, but from gratitude. Her life was changing, piece by piece. She was still the same woman, still humble, still working hard, but now the world looked at her differently. She had crossed a bridge she once thought impossible. As she went to bed that night, she whispered to herself, "Maybe dreams don't die. Maybe they just wait for the right time." She closed her eyes with a small smile, unaware that the best chapter of her life, the one where her music would touch even more hearts, was still yet to come. The days following the party felt different for the maid. Everything in the mansion looked the same. The shining floors, the tall curtains, the scent of polished wood. But she could feel a quiet change in the air. The same guests who once ignored her now greeted her kindly when they visited. Some even asked about her music, their voices filled with genuine curiosity. She didn't quite know how to feel. She was still a maid, still waking up before sunrise, still doing the same chores she'd always done. But now when she entered a room, people didn't just see a worker. They saw something more. A woman with talent, a story, a spark of something they couldn't quite explain. The lady of the house treated her differently too. Her words were softer, her tone less distant. One morning, while she was dusting the piano, the lady stopped by and said quietly, "You played beautifully that night. I've been thinking about it ever since." The maid looked down, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she whispered. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble." The lady smiled faintly. "You didn't cause trouble. You gave everyone something they didn't expect, and something beautiful." She paused before walking away. "Keep that safe. Not everyone is given a gift like that." Those words stayed in the maid's mind for days. She continued her work, but every free moment she had, she found herself drawn back to the piano. Late at night, when the mansion slept, she would sit on the bench and play softly, her heart full of quiet joy. But even with that happiness, a deep uncertainty lived inside her. The old piano teacher had offered to help her return to music, but she didn't know if she should accept. It felt like a dream too big for someone like her. Could a maid really go back to being a pianist? Could she really walk into a music school again after all these years? One evening, as she played a gentle tune, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, her hands freezing over the keys. It was the old piano teacher again, holding his hat in his hands and smiling kindly. "I thought I'd find you here," he said softly. "You play as if the piano were part of you." The maid stood up nervously. "I'm sorry. I didn't know anyone was here. I was just—" He waved his hand. "No need to explain. I came to see you. I meant what I said before. You shouldn't let your gift fade away." She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the floor. I can't, she said quietly. I have work. I have responsibilities. My family depends on what I earn here. The teacher nodded slowly. I understand. Life doesn't always give us easy choices. But let me tell you something, music doesn't wait forever. The world forgets many things, but it never forgets true talent. And what you have is rare, she didn't reply. His words were kind, but they scared her. Hope was a dangerous thing when you'd spent years learning to live without it. Before leaving, he handed her a folded piece of paper. This is the address of the school, he said. They have open sessions on Sundays. No fees, no commitment. Just go once, listen. Play if you feel like it. That's all I ask. He left quietly, and she stood there holding the paper for a long time. It felt light in her hand, but heavy in meaning. That night she lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her thoughts were a storm of fear and longing. She imagined walking into that school again. The sound of instruments, the smell of polished wood, the laughter of students. She missed it more than she wanted to admit. But what if she had forgotten everything? What if they laughed at her? Morning came and she went back to work. The days were busy, filled with chores, visitors, and endless cleaning. But that small piece of paper stayed tucked safely inside her apron pocket. Every time she touched it, she felt a spark of courage. When Sunday arrived, she finally decided to go. She finished her work early, changed into her simplest dress, and left the mansion quietly. The city streets were calm, filled with the smell of bread from nearby bakeries and the sound of children playing. She followed the address until she found herself standing in front of a small building with a wooden sign that read, Music Conservatory. Her hands shook slightly as she pushed open the door. Inside, she heard the sound of a piano, not grand or dramatic, but light and cheerful. A few students sat in a small hall, chatting and laughing. She stood at the doorway, unsure whether she belonged there. The old teacher spotted her and smiled warmly. You came, he said. I knew you would. He led her to a piano near the back of the room. No one here is judging you, he said gently. Play whatever you like. Her heart pounded as she sat down. For a moment she couldn't move. Then she closed her eyes and began to play. The first few notes were shaky, but soon the melody took shape. The room grew quiet as everyone turned to listen. The sound was simple yet full of emotion. Even the students, some much younger than her, were captivated. When she finished, the teacher smiled. See, he said. You belong here. Tears filled her eyes. It feels like I've come home, she whispered. From that day on, she visited the school every Sunday. She didn't tell anyone at the mansion. It was her secret, her one piece of freedom. She practiced with quiet determination, slowly rebuilding the skills she thought she had lost. The teacher guided her patiently, reminding her that music wasn't about perfection but about heart. As weeks turned into months, her confidence grew. Her fingers moved faster, her emotions deeper. The teacher often said, You play like someone who has lived many lives. And maybe she had. The hardships, the loneliness, the laughter, and the quiet nights, they all lived in her music now. One afternoon, the teacher told her something that made her stop playing mid-song. There's a small performance at the community center next month, he said. A few of my students are performing. I'd like you to join them. She shook her head quickly. No, I can't. I'm not ready. I'm not like them, he smiled patiently. You're more ready than you think. Sometimes the world needs to see what you've been hiding. The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with a strange excitement. That night, as she returned to the mansion, she found herself smiling for no reason. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to something. But life, as it often does, had its own plans. One evening, while she was playing quietly in the mansion, the lady of the house walked in unexpectedly. The maid froze, her hands stopping mid-note. The lady watched for a moment before speaking softly. You still play every night? The maid nodded, embarrassed. Only when I'm finished with my work. The lady walked closer, her expression thoughtful. Do you know, she said, some of our guests are still talking about you. One of them even asked if you'd play at their event next month. The maid's heart skipped a beat. Play at their event? Yes, the lady said. They were touched by your performance that night. They want you to play again. If you're willing, of course. The maid didn't know what to say. 2 invitations, one from the teacher, one from the guests. It was as if the world was giving her 2 doors to walk through, and both led toward the same dream she thought she had lost forever. That night, she sat by the piano long after everyone had gone to sleep. Her fingers moved slowly across the keys, her heart full of questions. Could she really do it? Could a maid step out of her uniform even for one night and become a musician again? The more she thought about it, the clearer her answer became. Yes, she could. Because deep down she knew music wasn't about who you were on the outside. It was about what lived inside you. She closed her eyes and began to play, her melody floating softly through the empty mansion. It was a song full of hope, the sound of someone finally daring to believe again. And though she didn't know it yet, that decision, to play again, would change everything in her life forever. The room fell completely silent as the maid sat at the piano. Every sound, the laughter, the clinking glasses, even the whispers, and disappeared. Only the faint hum of the chandelier lights filled the air. Her hands rested on the keys, frozen, her heart beating so fast she thought everyone could hear it. She could feel all the eyes on her, the wealthy guests, the servants standing near the walls, and the family who looked half amused, half worried. She had never felt smaller in her life. Part of her wanted to stand up and say she couldn't do it. She wasn't a performer. She was just a maid. But another part of her, a small, quiet voice deep inside, whispered that this might be the only chance she would ever get to show who she truly was. Her hands trembled slightly as she took a slow breath. She pressed the first key. A soft, gentle note filled the air. Then another and another. The melody began to grow, one note after another, smooth and full of emotion. The laughter that had echoed minutes earlier turned into silence. People leaned forward, surprised. Her fingers moved faster now, more confident. It was as if something inside her had broken free. The music that had lived inside her heart for years came pouring out through her hands. She forgot where she was. She forgot the faces staring at her. She wasn't playing for them, she was playing for herself. For all the nights she had cleaned that piano when no one cared. For all the dreams she had buried under years of struggle. Her eyes closed, her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. Each note carried a piece of her life. Her lost childhood dreams, her family's struggles, her loneliness, her hope. The melody wasn't just beautiful. It was alive. It filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Even the servants standing in the corner felt tears rising in their eyes. The guests who had laughed at her earlier now sat motionless, stunned. The lady of the house stared in disbelief, her wine glass forgotten in her hand. The old piano teacher smiled softly, nodding to himself. He knew what everyone else was only beginning to realize, that the maid before them wasn't just someone who cleaned floors and carried trays. She was an artist who had been hiding behind a uniform. As she played, the room seemed to fade away. Her fingers danced across the keys, her movements graceful and natural. The notes grew louder, filling every corner of the mansion. The chandelier lights shimmered like stars above her. It felt as if time had stopped. When the final note came, it hung in the air for a long, delicate moment before fading into silence. No one moved. It was as if the entire house was holding its breath. The maid slowly lifted her hands from the keys and sat still, her head slightly bowed. Then, one by one, the guests began to clap. Softly at first, then louder until the sound filled the room. It wasn't polite applause. It was real, full of awe and emotion. The maid looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. She hadn't expected that. For a second, she didn't even know how to react. She just sat there, her heart full and trembling. The lady of the house stood speechless. She didn't know what to say. The old piano teacher stepped forward, smiling warmly. That, he said softly, was music from the soul. The maid rose quickly, flustered. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have." But before she could finish, one of the guests interrupted. "No, please don't apologize," the woman said with tears in her eyes. "That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years." The room buzzed with emotion. People began asking questions. Where she learned, how long she'd been playing, why she never told anyone. The maid felt overwhelmed. She wasn't used to so much attention. She bowed slightly and stepped back, her hands trembling. The lady of the house forced a smile and tried to regain her composure. "Well," she said stiffly, "it seems our maid has been keeping a secret talent." Her tone was calm, but inside she was conflicted. Part of her felt proud that something so extraordinary had happened in her home. Another part felt embarrassed, that she, who had looked down on the maid, had never seen her for who she truly was. The rest of the evening, the guests couldn't stop talking about the performance. The piano teacher, still amazed, approached the lady privately. "She's gifted," he said. That kind of emotion doesn't come from training alone. It comes from life. You should encourage her. The lady nodded quietly, not sure how to respond. She's just a maid, she finally said, though her voice lacked conviction. Later that night, after the guests had left and the laughter had faded, the maid stayed behind to clean up. The same piano that had once been her secret companion now stood as a silent witness to everything that had happened. She touched its surface gently, her reflection faintly visible on the polished wood. She didn't know whether she had done the right thing by playing. Maybe she had gone too far. Maybe the family would be angry. But deep down she couldn't regret it. For the first time in years she had felt alive. Not invisible, not just a worker, but a person with something beautiful inside her. As she wiped the piano, the lady of the house entered quietly. The maid straightened immediately, lowering her eyes. "I'm sorry, madam," she said softly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble."
They asked me to play, and the lady raised her hand gently.
"You don't need to apologize," she said after a pause. Her voice was calm, almost thoughtful. "I didn't know you could play like that. Why didn't you tell anyone?" The maid hesitated. "It wouldn't have mattered," she said honestly. "No one wants to hear about a maid's dreams." The lady looked at her for a long time, something softening in her eyes. "Well," she said finally, "you made everyone cry tonight. That's something few people can do." She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, she added quietly, "You have a gift. Don't hide it again." When the lady left, the maid stood there for a while, her heart full of emotions she couldn't describe. She sat down at the piano once more and pressed a single key, just to feel it, just to remind herself it was real. The next morning, the household felt different. The air was lighter somehow. The servants smiled at her with respect now, whispering kind words instead of gossip. Even the lady of the house greeted her more gently than before. But word spread quickly. By the afternoon, the story had reached people outside the mansion. Guests who attended the party couldn't stop talking about the maid who played like a professional pianist. Some even called it a miracle. A few days later, the old piano teacher returned. He asked to speak with her privately. She met him in the piano room, nervous but curious. "I've been thinking about you," he said kindly. "You shouldn't waste this gift. I have a friend who runs a small music school. If you'd like, I can help you start again." The maid's eyes filled with tears. "I don't have money for lessons," she said softly. He smiled. "I'm not asking for money. I'm offering a chance. You've already learned what can't be taught. Heart. All you need now is a little guidance." She didn't know what to say. It felt like life was giving her back something she thought was gone forever. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll think about it." That night, as she lay in her small room, she couldn't sleep. Her mind replayed everything. The laughter, the silence, the applause. For so long she had hidden who she was, but now it was out in the open. And it felt both terrifying and wonderful. She didn't know what the future would bring. Maybe it would be hard again. Maybe the world would still judge her for her uniform. But now she had hope. Something stronger than fear. Before falling asleep, she whispered softly to herself, "Maybe my story isn't over yet." She didn't realize then that her story was only beginning, and that the same piano that once stood as her secret would soon become the key to her new life. The next few days passed quietly inside the mansion, but something had changed. The maid noticed how the other workers looked at her differently now. Some smiled, others whispered, and a few just stared. She knew the reason. The story of her secret piano playing had spread through the house like wildfire. At first, she tried to ignore it. She focused on her chores, cleaning, polishing, and arranging things just as she always did. But deep down, she felt uneasy. She had never wanted attention. The piano was her escape, her little corner of peace. Now even that felt uncertain. One evening, as she walked through the hallway carrying folded sheets, she overheard the butler talking to one of the cooks. "They say she plays beautifully," the cook whispered. "I didn't believe it at first, but the gardener swears it's true." The butler chuckled. "Well, I suppose everyone has a hidden side. Still, she'd better be careful. The mistress doesn't like her staff touching her things." Those words sent a chill through her. She knew they were true. If the lady of the house discovered she'd been using the piano, she could lose her job instantly. For a maid, jobs like this didn't come easily. She needed the money for her family, who depended on her small earnings. She couldn't risk it. That night she avoided the piano. She walked past it quickly, her heart heavy, the room feeling strangely empty without her music. The next night she did the same. But on the third night something pulled her back. She couldn't resist the silence that called to her. It was as if the piano itself was waiting, lonely and forgotten. She sat down carefully, glancing toward the door to make sure no one was near. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the piano lid. The keys gleamed under the soft light, and for a moment she just stared at them. Then she took a deep breath and began to play, softly at first, like a whisper. The sound flowed gently through the room. It wasn't a grand performance, just a simple melody filled with feeling. Her eyes closed as her hands moved on their own, remembering every note. It felt like breathing again after holding her breath for too long. While she played, she didn't think about being a maid or about the people who laughed at her. In those few moments, she was herself again. The girl who once dreamed of music, who once believed her life could be more than just cleaning other people's homes. What she didn't know was that the world outside the mansion was slowly changing too. A new event was being planned, a charity party hosted by the family. Important guests, musicians, and business people were all invited. The piano, which had been silent for years, would finally be part of the decoration again. One afternoon, the lady of the house called the staff together to discuss preparations. "Everything must be perfect," she said. "This event is important to us. I want the chandeliers polished, the floors shining, and that piano spotless." The maid nodded quietly, her heart thudding. She would have to clean the piano again, the same piano that held all her secrets. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, she walked into the living room and began polishing it carefully. The light from the chandelier reflected softly on the keys. As she wiped each one, she couldn't help but touch them gently. Just one note, she thought, only one. Her finger pressed a key and the familiar sound filled the air. That single note felt like a drop of rain falling into a dry pond. Then she pressed another and another, until the music started again, flowing, growing, filling the silence around her. She played with her heart wide open, unaware that one of the guests who had arrived early was standing by the doorway listening. He was an older man with kind eyes and white hair, a retired piano teacher and an old friend of the family. He watched her quietly, not wanting to interrupt. When she finished, he spoke gently. "You play beautifully." The maid froze, her heart racing. She turned quickly, her face pale. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to. I was just cleaning." The man smiled softly. "Don't be afraid. You have a gift. Not many people can play like that, especially after years away from music." She looked down, embarrassed. "I used to learn when I was younger, but I had to stop." He nodded, understanding. "Life takes us in unexpected directions. But talent like that doesn't disappear. You should never hide it." She wanted to thank him, but before she could, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hall. The man gave her a reassuring look and quietly left, leaving her alone again with the piano. Her hands trembled as she closed the lid, whispering to herself, "What have I done?" The next morning she went about her work nervously, expecting to be scolded. But no one said anything. The old man didn't mention it to the family. He simply smiled at her when their eyes met during the event preparations. For the first time in a long while she felt seen, not as a maid, but as a person. Days went by and the charity party drew closer. The mansion buzzed with excitement. Decorations went up, food was prepared, and guests began to arrive. The maid worked long hours, barely sleeping. Still, each time she passed the piano, her fingers itched to touch it again. One morning, the youngest daughter of the house approached her in the hallway. She looked curious. "You played the piano that night, didn't you?" she asked softly. The maid's eyes widened, unsure what to say. "Don't worry," the girl continued, smiling. "I won't tell anyone. I just wanted you to know it was beautiful." The maid didn't know how to respond. She just nodded and whispered, "Thank you." As the day of the party arrived, the house transformed into a world of light and laughter. Musicians came to set up their instruments, and the piano was polished until it shone like new. The maid stayed in the background, helping with food and decorations. That evening, the guests filled the room. The sound of conversation, music, and clinking glasses filled the air. The maid moved quietly between the tables, serving drinks, blending into the background as always. But deep inside, her heart beat faster every time she glanced at the piano. Then something unexpected happened. The pianist who had been hired to perform called in sick just hours before the event. The hosts were in a panic. "What do we do now?" the lady of the house said, pacing.
We can't have a silent piano.
The guests began to notice the tension. Someone joked loudly, maybe the maid can play for us. The room burst into laughter. The maid froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The lady of the house chuckled awkwardly and waved it off. Oh, don't be silly. She's here to serve, not to perform. But the old piano teacher, who had seen her play before, spoke up calmly. Actually, he said, I've heard her. She plays better than most professionals. The room went silent for a moment. The guests turned to look at the maid, who stood frozen near the corner, her face burning with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, but the teacher's words hung in the air, impossible to ignore. The lady of the house gave a nervous laugh. That can't be true, she said, trying to brush it off. But the teacher only smiled and said, why not let her try? All eyes turned to the maid. She felt her knees tremble. She wanted to say no, to hide, but something inside her, that same voice that made her play at night and whispered, this is your moment. The guests waited. Some were amused, others curious. The lady of the house sighed, clearly uncomfortable, but finally said, fine then. Let's see what she can do. The maid's heart pounded in her chest as she walked slowly toward the piano. Her hands shook and she could hear the faint sound of laughter behind her. But when she sat down and touched the keys, everything else faded away. Her fingers rested on the keys for a long moment. Then she took a deep breath. What happened next would be remembered by everyone in that room. But that night, before the music began, no one, not even she, knew that this would be the moment her life would change forever. In a quiet corner of a big city stood a mansion that looked like it had come straight out of a dream. The white walls shone under the morning sun, and the windows sparkled as if they were made of diamonds. Inside that grand house lived a wealthy family who loved to host parties and show off their success. The house had everything: chandeliers that lit up like stars, expensive paintings, and a huge piano sitting in the living room that hadn't been played in years. Every morning, before the family woke up, a maid would walk through those long marble halls with her cleaning tools. Her steps were soft, her movements careful. She didn't want to wake anyone. Her hair was always tied neatly, her uniform spotless, and her eyes showed a quiet tiredness, the kind that comes from long days and little rest. She'd been working in that mansion for nearly a year now, doing everything from polishing silverware to scrubbing floors. No one really noticed her. She was just the maid, the one who picked up after everyone, the one who disappeared into corners when guests arrived. But behind her calm and humble face was someone with a story no one had ever cared to ask about. Every evening, when her work was done and the family had gone to bed, she would quietly return to the living room to finish her last chore, dusting the piano. The instrument stood tall and elegant, covered by a thin layer of dust. Its keys hadn't been touched for years. Most of the time, she would wipe it down, close the lid, and move on. But some nights, when she was sure no one was watching, she would sit down on the piano bench for just a moment. Her hands, rough from cleaning, would hover over the keys. The moment her fingers touched them, something in her heart would stir. A memory, faint but beautiful, would rise inside her. A memory of when her life was filled with music instead of mops and buckets. She would press one key softly, then another. The soft sound would fill the empty room. She knew she shouldn't. It wasn't her place to play. But once the sound began, she couldn't stop. For those few minutes, she wasn't a maid. She was someone else entirely. Someone free, someone alive. She had once been a student at a small music school. It wasn't a fancy place, but it was enough for her to learn the thing she loved most: the piano. She had dreams then, big ones. She wanted to play on stage one day, to make people feel the same emotions she felt when she touched the keys. But dreams are fragile things, and life can be cruel. When her father fell sick and her mother lost her job, everything changed. She had to leave school and start working to keep her family alive. The piano lessons stopped, and so did her dream. Years passed, and though her hands became used to scrubbing floors instead of playing melodies, her heart never forgot. That's why, when she sat in front of the mansion's grand piano, her fingers still remembered what they once knew. It was like the music was sleeping inside her all those years, waiting to wake up again. One night, as she sat there, the moonlight slipped through the tall windows and fell across the piano keys. She played a small tune, something soft and slow. The sound was almost like a whisper, gentle enough not to wake anyone. Her eyes closed, and for a moment she could almost see her old self again, sitting in a small music room, smiling, surrounded by laughter and warmth. But the sound of a door creaking brought her back to reality. She quickly stopped playing, stood up, and wiped the piano as if nothing had happened. The next morning, when she brought tea to the dining room, she heard the lady of the house talking to her guests. "This piano," the lady said proudly, "was imported from Europe years ago. It's quite old now, though no one here knows how to play." One of the guests laughed and said, "Maybe your maid can try. She looks like she's hiding secrets." Everyone chuckled, including the lady of the house. The maid smiled politely and bowed her head, pretending not to hear. Inside, though, her heart ached. She had learned to stay quiet when people laughed. She had learned that the world rarely sees beyond a uniform. To them, she was just a maid. They didn't know about the little girl who once played music until her fingers hurt. They didn't know how she'd sit by the window as a child, listening to the radio and mimicking the notes on a wooden table because her family couldn't afford a real piano. They didn't know how much she had lost when she walked away from her dreams. Still, she was grateful. The job gave her food, a roof, and a little money she sent back home each month. She never complained. But sometimes, late at night when everyone else was asleep, she whispered to herself, "One day, maybe I'll play again." Weeks passed and life went on as usual. The mansion buzzed with activity, parties, dinners, and endless guests. The maid remained invisible, moving quietly through the noise. Yet she always found a few minutes to visit the piano room at night. It was her secret world, her place of peace. One evening, as she was cleaning, she found an old music sheet tucked behind the piano. It was worn out, yellow with age, but she recognized the notes immediately. It was a song she used to play years ago. She held the paper gently, like it was something precious. That night, she played it again. Her fingers shaky at first, then steady as the melody came alive. She didn't notice that someone had stopped by the doorway watching. It was the youngest daughter of the house who had come down to get some water. She stood silently, amazed by what she heard. The next morning, she told her mother, "The maid was playing the piano last night. She's really good." The lady laughed, waving it off. "Oh, darling, you must have dreamed it. She wouldn't dare touch that piano." The daughter didn't argue, but the music stayed in her mind. Meanwhile, the maid went about her day as usual, but deep inside she worried. If they found out she had touched the piano, she could lose her job. She decided not to play again. For days, she avoided even looking at the piano. She focused only on her work, even though her heart longed for those quiet moments of music. But as the days grew longer, the silence in the piano room felt heavy. One evening, when the house was empty, she couldn't resist anymore. She sat down again, letting her fingers glide over the keys. This time she played something joyful, something that reminded her of hope. The sound filled the big empty house like a memory returning home, and just like before, she didn't know someone was listening. The gardener, who was working late, stood by the window outside, frozen in surprise. He didn't say anything, but the next morning, whispers started among the staff. "Did you know she can play?" "No way, she's just the maid." "I heard it myself." "She plays beautifully." The whispers grew, reaching the family's ears. One afternoon, while serving tea, she overheard the lady of the house laughing with her friends again. "Our maid thinks she's a pianist now," one said. "Maybe she should play for us next time," another joked. The laughter filled the room. The maid kept her head down, her cheeks burning, but she said nothing. She had faced worse. Yet that night, as she cleaned the piano, tears fell silently on the keys. She wiped them away quickly, whispering to herself, "They can laugh all they want. They don't know my story." She didn't know then that her story was only beginning. That one day soon, the same people who mocked her would sit in stunned silence as her music brought tears to their eyes. For now, though she was just a maid in a big house, clinging to a secret dream. Her hands might have been rough and tired, but her heart still played melodies the world hadn't heard yet. Each night she waited for the sound of quiet, that precious moment when the mansion slept, so she could sit before the piano again and remind herself that even if the world forgot her talent, she never would.